Hello, Zero Books readers. In this video, we will be rethinking critical theory and LeftTube as we take excerpts from What is Postmodern Conservatism, Neglected and Misunderstood, Theodor Adorno, and give them an argument, Logic for the Left. Before we dive in, I want to address one of the commenters who, on our previous video, Rethinking Critical Theory with Guy Debord, asked, isn't the thing called critical theory always in the process of being rethought? Isn't the pairing of the word critical with theory, both of which necessitate change, the very agitation of that change? I understand the point you're making, at least I think I do, but it seems clear that critical theory already names the process and practice of change. Here are my brief answers to that comment. First of all, no. That is, no, critical theory is not always in the process of being rethought. And no, it isn't the case that pairing the word critical with the word theory is the very agitation of that change. Naming something isn't identical with doing something. Rethinking critical theory means returning to the history of the development of critical theory, and this involves a return to Marx. We need to avoid taking the presuppositions of what calls itself critical theory today, the critical theory taught in comparative literature departments, for granted. To rethink critical theory means turning away from an anti-systemic, eclectic, and largely rhetorical critical theory. Let me give you an example of the problem. The Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, a book used to introduce students to critical theory at Harvard, lumps together Marx and Heidegger in the same book. Not in order to set the ideas that these thinkers propounded against each other in dialectical battle, but more to provide an adequate sample of each theoretical approach, to present students with something like a menu of conceptual frameworks which they can then pick from as they play the game of interpreting the world through literature, or even more, the game of interpreting the world as literature. In our upcoming book, What is Postmodern Conservatism?, author Matt McManus criticizes the conservative psychologist Jordan Peterson for the shallowness of his complaints against critical theory. McManus notes that Peterson conflates the Frankfurt School critical theories with post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida. But while this conflation is inaccurate and unfair, it is also the move that defines the approach taken by liberal arts proponents of the Norton Anthology School of Critical Theory. Distinctions have been blurred, and Marx's critique of political economy is no longer the foundation for critical theory, but instead, critical theory is taken to be a word that describes a discourse that resists any framework and all foundations. Just why and how this has happened isn't entirely clear, but there are, ironically enough, several suggested answers on offer. We can, quite literally, take our pick of critical judgments on education, on ideology, and on judgment itself. For example, back in 1976, the Marxist theorist Russell Jacoby, the author of Dialectics of Defeat and the star of the documentary film Velvet Prisons, Russell Jacoby on American Academia, suggested that the reason our discourse is degrading is that we're getting stupider every day. We are, according to Jacoby, suffering under what he called the law of the declining rate of intelligence. Jacoby wrote, "The law of the falling rate of intelligence is even more elusive than the law of the falling rate of profit. For unlike the falling rate of profit, its effect undermines its own conceptualization." In the essay, Jacoby attempts to both sketch out the law of the falling rate of profit and to explore how the forces that create a decline in profitability could also lead to a decline in general intelligence. But Jacoby's argument would be a lot more convincing if he'd managed to get the falling rate of profit theory right. His difficulty here is that he relies on Paul Sweezy's book, The Theory of Capitalist Development, for his description of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is ironic as Sweezy thinks this law no longer applies to today's society due to monopolization and the development of state capitalism. The various ways Sweezy breaks with Marx are numerous and complex, too numerous and complex to fully work out in this video, so I'll have to take it up again in a future video or podcast. But to be brief, Sweezy is a kind of underconsumptionist, whereas the theory of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall revolves around overproduction and a resulting decline in the rate of the production of value based on labor time. However, it turns out the details of this law of the rate of profit declining aren't of any particular significance in Jacoby's essay, because what is significant for him aren't any economic processes, but the social consequences of those processes. And it's on this point that Jacoby obviously goes wrong. He argues that as the amount of fixed capital increases and the amount of labor time decreases, the workforce becomes more passive. But this argument involves an obvious equivocation, as Jacoby describes what Marx called living labor as spontaneous living activity, even as he admits that the term actually refers to what Marx describes as activity cast in a passive form. For Marx, the worker's subjectivity, when acting out this role as living labor, is penurious or impoverished. Marx hardly sees the average factory worker turning a knob or tightening one bolt over and over again as a fount of creative energy and spontaneity. Jacoby does a bit of literary sleight of hand. He suggests that the increase in congealed or dead labor at the point of production leads to the development of a somnambulant working class. But given that work itself is deadening under capitalism, this increase in congealed labor or in machinery and other forms of capital only creates unemployment and real poverty for workers, but doesn't involve any necessary impoverishment of the working class's imagination or intelligence. Certainly no more than would be the case if they were in the factory working and being exploited. In reality, what Jacoby is doing is dressing up a rather common concern with Marxist language. He's worried about the same thing that Gene Roddenberry worried about in the original series of Star Trek in an episode called Spock's Brain. Namely, what he's worried about is that when we let our machines do our thinking for us, whether at home or at work or in the streets, we risk becoming overly reliant on them. We risk becoming stupid.
Brain and brain! What is brain? It is controller, is it not?
In this third season episode from the classic science fiction series, the Enterprise is invaded by a bimbo from a planet of bimbos. She is named Kara, and she has been sent on a desperate mission by the computer that runs her planet. A mission that will involve a radical surgical procedure and that will leave Leonard Nimoy speechless. Her mission is, of course, to steal Spock's brain, because the people of her planet, having been lulled into complacency by the labor-saving devices invented by their ancestors, and after having expelled the males of their species, forcing them to live on the barren surface rather than in the technological wonderland that they inherited, they must seek out a new smart person's brain every once in a while in order to keep the computers that run their civilization functioning. Jacoby's notion of the declining rate of intelligence is no more profound than this Star Trek episode. It is a just so story, but it's about a real problem that he witnessed, namely the decline of the university system during the transition from Fordism to neoliberalism. What Jacoby describes is what we would think of today as the attention economy. He explains how professors hurry to produce many papers without much concern for the quality of their work, as the name of the game is to gain attention and citations. In an academic setting where new observations and new research is being churned out constantly, a professor is better off focusing on his own churning rather than risking pursuing fully worked out ideas and thoughts. In terms of ROI, return on investment, churning out half-baked papers is more likely to reap the reward of attention and advancement than risking spending time on developing an idea that will most likely turn out just to be wrong. Surely, we in LeftTube are facing similar pressures. In fact, the opposition between quality and quantity is openly noted and debated by YouTubers and YouTube gurus.
So recently I've been thinking a lot about quality versus quantity on YouTube. You might just think it's kind of a false question, like, well, of course you need quality and quantity, but I actually think there is a real winner, something that you really should be doing as a YouTube creator. I mean, you've got a limited amount of time and money and effort, so you can choose to make either more lower quality videos or fewer better quality videos. So let's consider these two things in turn, quality and quantity. I mean, a lot of videos are popular on YouTube and you don't really need a great camera or good lighting, good framing, good focus, without good audio, and you can just sit on your bed and talk about whatever you like.
We LeftTubers are as bad off as Jacoby and his colleagues, probably even worse off, which is precisely why we should be aware of the pressures we're facing, even as we understand that this understanding won't necessarily come cheap or even be of any benefit to us individually. So that said, I think rather than worry about a declining rate of generalized intelligence, we should look for an intellectual mistake that has become an unexamined assumption. One of the reasons Jacoby's essay suggesting a declining rate of intelligence would off the rails is because his analysis of capitalism, specifically his understanding of the mechanism through which capital reproduces itself as a self-expanding mode of production, relied on a body of work that held with what the theorist Moishe Postone called traditional Marxist assumptions. And it's not just Jacoby who is guilty of this. According to Postone, the entire Frankfurt School held with an understanding of capital as a mode of distribution through market relations, rather than as a mode of production determined by the creation of a value that sets up regular exchanges. That is, for a long time, most Marxists have only been looking at one side of capitalist relations. Postone, in his book Time, Labor, and Social Domination, wrote that when the Frankfurt School theorists such as Horkheimer and Adorno held with this traditional Marxist view, they identified the forces of production under capitalism with a transhistorical notion of labor. According to Postone, capitalist labor is defined by Horkheimer as a human attempt to gain control over nature. He questions the mode of its organization and application by market forces, but not its form. Instead of critiquing capitalism as a mode of production, a mode that includes a realm of distribution but isn't subsumed by distribution, the Frankfurt School turned to a critique of human power and a critique of humanity's domination of the natural world, or of nature. This conception of labor led them to suppose that once the market relations changed, once monopolies and states took on the role that had once been taken up by individual competitive capitalists, capitalism itself had changed. The problems and contradictions within the capitalist system had been overcome by capitalism itself, according to the Frankfurt School. Only this hadn't led to freedom, but to total domination by a new political class. Stuart Walton, in his book Neglected or Misunderstood, noted that Adorno thought that in late capitalist consumer culture, something is provided for everyone so that none may escape. And for Walton, this meant that Adorno would understand our contemporary digitized consumer culture as an extension of the political power that defined capitalism. Walton notes that nothing about targeted Facebook ads, boosted tweets, or the YouTube algorithm would have seemed unfamiliar to Adorno. Perhaps this is true, but what this idea that consumerism had created one-dimensional people, placated populations, leaves out is both the fact that resistance to consumer culture has defined the consumer culture for about 50 years, and that this resistance could still find a way to be transformed into revolutionary struggle. In his book, Give Them an Argument, Ben Burgis suggests that argumentation, the process of disambiguation and clarification, can still be useful, and that a left that only knows how to use shame and privilege checking to get what it wants is unprepared and even unable to work together to achieve its goals. I would add that one reason we may have ended up in this position of relying on shaming and privilege checking is that we no longer believe that an understanding of the mechanisms that determine our relations is necessary, because even after the economic crisis of 2008, we still believe that we're faced with a monolithic, impassive, corrupt, oppressive system of political control rather than by a political and economic system that is careening this way and that due to its own internal contradictions. Most of us believe that capitalism has righted itself, overcome itself, and that in the process, it's overcome us as well. If critical theory is to rediscover itself, if even the debased form of critical theory that we find on YouTube is to improve and advance, rather than constantly repeat itself and unconsciously repeat the same problems that have plagued the left for decades, I think we'll have to develop a critique of the critics, to take ourselves up in our own analysis and understand not only that our work isn't complete, but also to figure out in what direction we have to go. This will mean staging debates. It will mean looking for disagreements rather than a false sense of unity. Rather than looking for friends, we should be looking for frenemies. And that's exactly who I think I've found in the Frankfurt School, and especially in Russell Jacoby. While I don't agree with him about the falling rate of intelligence or the falling rate of profit, these disagreements are founded on what is, I think, fundamentally an agreement.
The sense of the possible has been dramatically limited, and they no longer think of the possibilities of transforming the world, or even of making a different kind of life. And in that sense, the concept of freedom has eroded.
Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.